If I could go back to last Tuesday, I wouldn't have signed for the package. I would have told the FedEx guy to take it back, burn it, or throw it into the deepest part of the Atlantic. Instead, I scribbled my signature on his digital pad at 11:42 a.m., dragged the heavy cardboard box into my living room, and sealed my fate with a box cutter. My fiancé, Mark, was at work, so I was the one who unveiled the heirloom. That's what the note called it. A heavy, mahogany chest about the size of a microwave, but weighing at least 30 pounds. It was from my great-aunt Eleanor, a woman I hadn't seen since I was 4 years old. She'd passed away in a nursing home in Vermont 3 weeks ago. And apparently, I was the only relative left who hadn't been explicitly written out of the will. I unlatched the brass fittings. They were stiff, coated in a layer of grime that left a gray smudge on my thumb. When I lifted the lid, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of old wood or silver polish. It smelled like stagnant water and copper, the way your hands smell after holding a fistful of pennies on a hot day. Inside, nestled in crushed, midnight blue velvet that looked wet but felt dry, was a complete 144-piece sterling silver cutlery set. Jackpot, Mark said later that evening, picking up a salad fork. Babe, do you know what this is worth? This is legitimate 19th century silver. Look at the hallmarks. He was right, objectively. It was beautiful, but it was also aggressive. The handles didn't feature the usual floral patterns or geometric Art Deco lines. The silver was cast into twisting thorny vines that looked like they were choking the handle. The tines of the forks were longer than standard, almost needle sharp, and the knives had a serrated edge that looked more suited for a butcher shop than a dinner table. It's creepy, I muttered, rubbing my arm. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly cooler, dropping from a comfortable 72 degrees to a chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It's antique, Mark corrected, laughing. He placed the fork back into its velvet groove. It made a soft thud that sounded too heavy for a piece of cutlery. We'll save it for special occasions. Or sell it if we need a down payment for a house. We closed the box. I watched him carry it to the dining room sideboard. He shoved it into the bottom cabinet, behind our fondue set and the blender we never use. That night, I had trouble sleeping. It was 2:15 a.m. when I finally drifted off. But right before I did, I had the distinct, irrational sensation that the house felt heavier, like we had added a new roommate who was sitting in the dark, waiting for us to close our eyes. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just spoons and forks, inanimate metal. My alarm went off at 6 a.m. sharp. I'm a creature of habit, coffee first, questions later. The sun hadn't even fully risen yet, casting the kitchen in a pale gray wash of early morning light. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic gurgle of the coffee pot brewing. I was reaching for my favorite mug in the overhead cabinet when I saw it. Sitting squarely in the center of our kitchen island was one of the silver dessert spoons. I froze, my hand hovering midair. It looked completely alien against our modern speckled granite countertop. The dark, tarnished silver absorbed the dim light rather than reflecting it. The thorny vines twisted up the handle, looking more like skeletal fingers than decorative flora. I walked over to it slowly. My brain immediately started running through the logic. Mark. It had to be Mark. He had a bad habit of sleep eating, usually peanut butter or ice cream, though he'd been doing better with his diet lately. I picked it up. It was freezing. Not just room temperature cool, but ice cold, like it had been sitting in the freezer. There was no residue on it, no sticky peanut butter, no dried milk, no crumbs. It was perfectly clean. Seriously, Mark? I muttered, annoyed that he'd already broken into the antique set we'd agreed to keep safe. I walked into the bedroom, the cold metal pressing uncomfortably against my palm. Mark was dead asleep, snoring softly with one arm hanging off the bed. Hey, I nudged him with my foot. Mark, he groaned, rolling over and squinting one eye open. Was it? Is the house on fire? No, but why did you dig into the silver chest? We literally just packed it away. He blinked, confusion spreading across his sleep-puffed face. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about? I haven't touched that box since I put it in the sideboard. I've been asleep since 11. There was a spoon on the island, I pressed, feeling a prickle of irritation. Come on, did you have a midnight snack? I swear to God, babe, he said, and his voice had that gravelly honesty of the truly exhausted. I didn't get up. I didn't touch the spoons. Maybe you left it out when we were unpacking? I knew I hadn't. I am meticulous. I counted the stacks. I remembered watching him latch the mahogany lid. I went back out to the dining room to put the spoon back. I knelt in front of the sideboard and opened the cabinet doors. The mahogany chest was exactly where we'd left it, tucked behind the fondue set. Here's the thing that made my stomach drop. The brass latches were still fastened. I had to undo the clasps to open the lid. I placed the spoon back into its empty velvet slot, the third one from the left in the dessert row. It fit with a snug click. I stared at the box for a long moment. If Mark hadn't taken it out, and the box was latched, how did the spoon get to the kitchen? I closed the lid and pushed the heavy latches down until they clicked. Click, click. Sounded final. Just forget it, I whispered to the empty room. But as I walked back to my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room behind me was holding its breath. The spoon I could write off. A prank, a memory lapse, a sleepwalking incident. The human brain is excellent at filling in gaps with rational lies. For the next 48 hours, life was aggressively normal. I went to work, Mark went to work, and the mahogany box sat undisturbed in the sideboard cabinet. But the knife changed the narrative. It was Thursday, around 5:45 p.m. I had just gotten home and wanted to repot a basil plant that was dying on the windowsill. I walked into the mudroom, a small, enclosed porch off the kitchen where we kept our cleaning supplies and gardening tools. The room was usually chilly, but today the air felt thick, humid, and heavy. Immediately, the smell hit me. It wasn't the earthy scent of dirt or the chemical sting of bleach. It smelled like a struck match, sharp sulfur mixed with that cloying metallic scent of old silver polish. I looked down at the bag of Miracle-Gro sitting on the washing machine. Sticking out of the center of the bag, buried up to the hilt, was one of Great Aunt Eleanor's steak knives. It hadn't just been dropped. It had been driven into the soil with force. The heavy silver handle, with its twisting, thorny vine pattern, stood upright like a chrome tombstone. "Mark!" My voice cracked. I sounded shrill, panicked. Mark came jogging in from the living room, still in his work tie. What happened?" I pointed at the soil bag. My hands were shaking so bad I had to cross my arms to hide it. Mark froze. He looked at the knife, then at me, then back at the knife. The color drained out of his face. He just walked over, hesitated, and then reached out to pull it free. It took effort. The soil held onto the serrated blade with suction. When it finally came loose with a wet huck sound, the blade was coated in black earth. "I didn't do this," Mark whispered, staring at the dirty blade. "I know," I said, and I meant it. "I checked the box this morning, Mark. I checked it before I left for work. It was latched." Mark marched into the dining room, holding the dirty knife away from his body like it was radioactive. He practically ripped the cabinet doors open and hauled the mahogany chest out onto the floor. The brass latches were secure. He flipped them open and threw back the lid. We both stared at the velvet interior. In the bottom tray, where the 12 steak knives were supposed to be nestled in a row, there was one empty slot. The gap in the velvet looked like a missing tooth. "How?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. "How does a knife get out of a locked box, travel 20 feet to the mudroom, and stab a bag of dirt by itself?" The smell of sulfur in the mudroom had been faint, but standing over the open box, it was stronger now. It was rising from the velvet lining, pungent and angry. "I don't know," I said, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my spine. "But I don't think we should keep this. Rationality dies in stages. First, you deny it. Then, you try to outsmart it." After the knife incident, Mark and I stopped joking. The air in the house had shifted from vaguely uncomfortable to hostile. We didn't want to touch the silver, but we couldn't just leave it loose. I found the original key taped to the underside of the box lid. A small, heavy skeleton key made of the same tarnished brass as the latches. "Lock it," Mark said. He was standing 3 feet away, arms crossed, refusing to get closer. I put the knife back, after washing the soil off with scalding water, closed the heavy lid, and inserted the key. The mechanism was stiff. It required force to turn, grinding with a sound like crushing bone until it clicked into place. I tugged on the lid. It held fast. "There," I said, trying to sound confident. "It's locked. Unless the ghost has a locksmithing degree, they stay in there." I took the key and put it inside my jewelry box in the bedroom, buried under a tangle of old necklaces. I locked the jewelry box, too, double security. We ordered pizza that night because neither of us wanted to cook in the kitchen. We ate in the living room with the TV volume up too high, trying to drown out the silence of the house. Every creak of the floorboards made us jump. I woke up the next morning at 7:15 a.m. Sunlight was streaming through the blinds, making the terror of the previous evening feel silly, almost dreamlike. That's the trick daylight plays on you. It bleaches out the fear. I walked out of the bedroom, yawning, heading for the kitchen. To get there, I had to pass through the dining area. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched in my throat. The mahogany box was still on the sideboard, exactly where we'd left it. The lid was closed. But on the dark wood of our dining table, 3 dinner forks were arranged with mathematical precision. They weren't just scattered. They were laid out in a perfect fan shape, the handles touching at a central point and the tines spreading outward. They looked like a silver hand splayed open on the table, and the sharp, needle-like tines were pointing directly at the hallway. I had just walked out of the hallway, directly at our bedroom. "No," I whispered. "No way." I ran back to the bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs. I unlocked my jewelry box and dug through the necklaces. The brass key was exactly where I had hidden it, cold and heavy. I grabbed it and sprinted back to the dining room. I jammed the key into the chest's lock. It wouldn't turn left. It was already locked. I had to turn it right to unlock it. The mechanism ground loudly, resisting me. Before the latch popped, I threw the lid open. The velvet interior was undisturbed, except for 3 empty slots in the dinner fork row. The physics of it made my head spin. The box had been locked. The key had been with me, yet 3 solid steel objects had passed through an inch of mahogany wood and arranged themselves in a threat display. I looked back at the table. The morning sun hit the silver, but instead of gleaming, the metal seemed to swallow the light. The twisting vines on the handles looked tighter today, more constricted. And then I noticed something else. A small detail I had missed in my panic. The table underneath the forks, the wood itself was scratched. Deep gouges radiated out from where the tines rested, as if the forks had been dragged into position with immense downward pressure. They hadn't just appeared there. Something heavy had pressed them into the table. By Saturday morning, the exhaustion of constant vigilance began to feel like a physical weight. Mark and I were barely speaking, the tension between us as sharp as the silver in the other room. He wanted to throw the set in the river. I, gripped by a stubborn, desperate need for logic, wanted to prove it was all a psychological trick. "It's just metal, Mark," I snapped, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "It's silver. It has no agency. It has no soul." I walked into the dining room. I unlocked the chest with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. I reached for a small dessert spoon, the same one I had found on the island days before. "What are you doing?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "I'm using it," I said. "I'm using it to stir my coffee, and when nothing happens, we're gonna realize we've just been scaring ourselves over a few coincidences." I poured a fresh cup of coffee. The steam rose in a gentle plume. I gripped the thorny handle of the spoon. It felt strangely oily, though it looked perfectly clean. As I lowered the silver into the hot liquid, something felt wrong. The moment the metal touched the coffee, I didn't feel the warmth of the liquid traveling up the handle. I felt a surge of heat so intense it was like grabbing a live wire. I gasped, but I didn't drop it. I was determined. I brought the spoon to my lips to taste the coffee. The second the silver touched my tongue, the heat didn't just burn, it sizzled. I heard a faint, wet sound, the sound of my own flesh searing. But it wasn't just the heat. A flavor exploded in my mouth, so foul and overwhelming that I gagged instantly. It didn't taste like coffee. It didn't even taste like silver. It tasted like rot, like meat that had been left in a sun-drenched car for a week. It tasted like copper and old clotted blood. I spat the liquid out, dropping the spoon. It hit the floor with a heavy clack, but it didn't bounce. It just stayed there, dead and cold. "Oh my God, your mouth," Mark screamed. I ran to the bathroom, clutching my face. When I looked in the mirror, I let out a muffled sob. My tongue and the roof of my mouth weren't just red from a burn, they were turning a bruised, sickly gray. A perfect, blackened outline of the spoon was seared into my taste buds. I rinsed my mouth with cold water again and again, but the taste wouldn't leave. It felt like it was seeping into my throat, into my very lungs. Every breath I took smelled like a morgue. I looked down at the sink. The water I spat out was laced with thin, dark threads. Not bright red blood, but something darker. Something that looked like old oxidized ink. "Get it out," it choked out. the words scratching my blistered throat. "Mark, get that box out of this house. Now." But when we went back to the kitchen to grab the spoon from the floor, it was gone. The floor was empty. I looked at the dining room sideboard. The mahogany chest was closed, and through the heavy wood, I could hear a faint, rhythmic sound. Clink, 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 like a finger tapping impatiently on the inside of the lid. The taste of rot lingered. No matter how much peppermint oil I used, or how many times I brushed my teeth until my gums bled, that copper and carrion flavor stayed rooted at the back of my throat. It was 9 p.m. on Saturday. Mark was sitting on the sofa, staring blankly at a muted television, his leg bouncing nervously. He didn't want to go near the sideboard, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. But I needed to know. My mind was fracturing under the weight of how. "I'm setting up the trail cam," I whispered. Mark didn't even look at me. "Do whatever you want. I'm not touching that thing." I went to the garage and grabbed the motion-activated camera Mark uses for deer hunting. It's a rugged, black plastic unit with infrared night vision. I returned to the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The mahogany box sat on the sideboard, silent and imposing. I mounted the camera on a tripod in the corner of the room, angling the lens to cover the sideboard, the dining table, and the kitchen island. I made sure the SD card was empty and the batteries were fresh. "If something moves," I told the empty room, "I'm going to see you." I spent the night on the living room floor with Mark. Neither of us suggested the bedroom. The thought of those 3 forks pointing at our pillows was too fresh. We left every light in the house on, but it didn't help. The light felt thin, easily swallowed by the shadows that seemed to congregate in the corners of the ceiling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was usually full of comforting sounds. The hum of the fridge, the settling of the foundation. But tonight, the silence was jagged. Around 3 a.m., the temperature in the living room plummeted. My breath began to mist in front of my face. Then, from the dining room, I heard it. Scurrit. It was the sound of metal dragging across wood. A slow, deliberate movement. Clink. My body locked up. I wanted to scream, to run in there and smash that box to splinters. But my muscles felt like they had been turned to lead. Beside me, Mark's breathing hitched. He was awake too. We held hands, our palms slick with cold sweat, listening to the hidden symphony of the silver. It lasted for exactly 7 minutes. Then, a heavy thud, the sound of the cabinet door being kicked shut, echoed through the house. The silence that followed was even worse. It felt expectant. I didn't move until the sun started to bleed through the curtains at 6:30 a.m. My joints were stiff, and my mouth felt like it was filled with ash. I stood up, wiped my face, and walked into the dining room. The camera's red event light was blinking. It had recorded something. My hand shook so violently, I nearly dropped the camera as I unscrewed it from the tripod. Mark stood in the doorway, his face a mask of pale exhaustion, watching me. I took the SD card to my laptop and sat at the kitchen table. My mouth still tasted like pennies and old meat. "Are you sure you want to see this?" Mark asked. I didn't answer. I just hit play. The first few hours of footage were static, just a grainy, black and white view of our dining room. The infrared light made the mahogany chest look like a dark, sucking void in the corner of the frame. Then, the timestamp hit 3:33 a.m. The camera didn't trigger because the box moved. It triggered because the shadows changed. In the video, the shadows in the corner behind the sideboard began to lengthen, stretching out like ink spilled on water. They didn't move with the light, they moved independently, crawling up the side of the cabinet. A hand emerged from the darkness. I choked back a sob. It wasn't a human hand. It was long, impossibly thin, and translucent like a veil of smoke shaped into a limb. The fingers were elongated, ending in sharp, jagged points that mimicked the thorny patterns on the silver handles. The hand didn't unlock the box. It reached through the wood. I watched, transfixed by horror, as the smoky fingers submerged into the mahogany lid as if it were liquid. A second later, the hand pulled back out. Gripped between its elongated fingers was a dinner knife. The entity, or whatever it was, didn't stand up. It stayed merged with the shadows, just a long, flickering arm reaching out from the void. It placed the knife on the table. Then it reached back in. One by one, it began to pull out more pieces. "Look at the way it's holding them," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. The shadow hand wasn't just moving the silver, it was caressing it, It ran its wispy fingers along the serrated edges of the blades with a sickening rhythmic devotion. It looked like a mother grooming a child, or a killer sharpening a tool. Then, the hand stopped. In the video, the translucent limb turned. The wrist twisted 180 degrees. The hand pointed its long, smoky index finger directly at the camera lens. It stayed like that for a full minute, perfectly still. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it lunged. The screen exploded into static. The last frame before the feed cut out was a close-up of the silver handle of a fork, the thorny vines appearing to writhe and pulse like a heartbeat. I slammed the laptop shut. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. "It saw us," I whispered. It knew the camera was there. I looked over at the dining table. It was empty. The silver was back in its box. But when I looked closer at the camera I was still holding, I realized the plastic casing was melted. 5 deep, narrow indentations were seared into the side of the device, exactly where a hand would have gripped it. The melted plastic of the camera smelled like ozone and burnt hair. I couldn't stay in that house a second longer without answers. While Mark sat on the porch, refusing to step back inside, I dialed my mother. She's the keeper of the family secrets, the one who usually gossips about who's getting divorced or who's gone broke. "Mom," I said, my voice sounding like it was being pulled through gravel. "Tell me about Aunt Eleanor. Tell me about the silver." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "I told them to melt that set down," she whispered. Her voice lacked its usual judgmental bite. She sounded genuinely afraid. "I told them it was tainted." "Why do you have it, Sarah? Did that lawyer actually send it to you?" "It's in my dining room, Mom. It's moving." "What happened to her?" My mother sighed, a shaky, ragged sound. "Eleanor didn't just pass away in that home. She was there because of what happened at her final dinner party in 1974. She was hosting the local historical society. Everything was perfect. The table was set with that Victorian service, and then the screaming started. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "What? Screaming?" She claimed the knives slipped. She said the forks wanted to taste. By the time the police arrived, 3 guests were dead. They were found at the table, Sarah. They hadn't even tried to run. They were pinned to their chairs by the cutlery. The police never found the weapon that did the real damage, the one that caused the blood loss, but Eleanor was covered in it. She spent the rest of her life in a padded room, screaming that she had to keep them polished, that if they stayed shiny, they'd stay full. "Mom, I used a spoon. I tasted rot." "Oh God," my mother choked out. "Sarah, listen to me. Eleanor didn't die of old age. They found her 3 weeks ago in her room at the asylum. She had swallowed 4 of the dessert spoons. They were wedged in her throat. The doctors said there was no way she could have physically forced them down herself. It was like they grew there. I looked at the kitchen islands. I could still feel the phantom outline of that spoon on my tongue, the gray, dead skin peeling away in strips. The police returned the set to the estate," Mom continued, her voice rising in panic. "They said it was evidence, but there were no prints. No biological matter. Just clean, polished silver. Sarah, get out of that house. Don't look at it. Don't touch it. It doesn't want to be owned. It wants to be fed." I hung up. I looked through the doorway into the dining room. The mahogany box felt like it had grown larger, more dominant in the room. The smell of sulfur and old blood was so thick, now I could see a faint, shimmering haze in the air around the sideboard. It wasn't an heirloom. It was a harvest. I didn't tell Mark about the dinner party in 1974. I couldn't. He was already at a breaking point, pacing the porch with his head in his hands. But the house didn't care about our silence. The house was already changing. "We're leaving," Mark said, slamming the screen door as he stepped back inside. "I don't care about the value. I don't care about the history. Grab a bag. We're going to a hotel." I nodded, my legs feeling like water. I turned to head toward the bedroom, but as I passed the dining room, I stopped. The smell was no longer just sulfur. It was the unmistakable, copper-heavy scent of a butcher shop. "Mark," I whispered. "Look." The cabinet doors of the sideboard were wide open. They hadn't been opened. They had been shattered from the inside out. The wood splintered and hanging from the hinges. The mahogany chest sat on the floor, its lid thrown back. It was empty. All 144 pieces were gone. "Where are they?" Mark's voice rose to a frantic pitch. He started spinning around, looking at the floor, the ceiling, the counters. Sarah, where did they go? We found them in the bedroom. I heard Mark let out a sound, a low, wet whimper as he reached the doorway. I pushed past him, and my stomach turned over. Our bed was covered. The silver pieces weren't just scattered. They were tucked under the duvet, arranged in a terrifyingly neat grid. But it was Mark's pillow that stopped my heart. A single butter knife was resting exactly where his neck would have been. I'm done, Mark breathed. I'm done. He grabbed his duffel bag and started throwing clothes in, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his phone twice. I did the same, stuffing a handful of essentials into a backpack. My mouth was throbbing, the gray burn on my tongue pulsing with every heartbeat. Suddenly, Mark let out a sharp, hissing yelp. He clutched his chest, dropping the duffel bag. Mark? What is it? He pulled his hand away. His white t-shirt was blooming with a bright, sudden red. He reached under the collar and pulled. A silver fish fork, the tiny, three-tined kind, tumbled out from inside his shirt and hit the floor with a heavy thud. It hadn't been there a second ago. I had watched him put that shirt on this morning. He lifted his shirt. There, right over his sternum, were 3 perfectly spaced puncture wounds. They weren't deep, but they were precise. They looked like they had been made by someone testing the sharpness of a tool. It's in my clothes, he gasped, his eyes wide with primal terror. Sarah, they're inside my clothes! He began stripping frantically, throwing his clothes across the room. As each garment hit the floor, a piece of silver clattered out of the folds. A spoon from his jeans, a dinner knife from his hoodie, a pastry fork from his sock. It was as if the set was colonizing him, clinging to him like parasites. Get out! I screamed, grabbing his arm. Just go! Leave the bags! We bolted for the front door, Mark in nothing but his boxers and a pair of sneakers. We didn't look back. We didn't lock the door. We just scrambled into the car and peeled out of the driveway, the tires screaming against the asphalt. But as we hit the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror. The lights in the house were flickering in a rhythmic pattern. Long, long, short. Long, long, short. And in the upstairs window, silhouetted against the light, I saw the long, smoky hand. It was holding a polishing cloth, buffing a large silver platter with slow circular motions. We spent the night in a motel 630 miles away. Mark didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the second bed, picking at the 3 puncture wounds on his chest, his eyes darting to every shadow cast by the flickering neon sign outside. I sat by the window, watching our car in the parking lot, half expecting the trunk to burst open with silver shrapnel. By 9 a.m., the adrenaline had curdled into a cold, hard desperation. We couldn't go back, but we couldn't just leave it there. If it was harvesting, as my mother hinted, leaving it in a suburban neighborhood was a death sentence for someone else. We sell it, Mark said, his voice hollow. We find a specialist, someone who deals in curiosities. I drove back to the house alone. Mark refused to step foot on the property. I kept the engine running, sprinted inside, and found the mahogany chest sitting on the kitchen island. It was closed, the velvet interior full once again, every piece gleaming with an unnatural oily luster. It felt heavier than 30 pounds as I luggled it to the car, much heavier. I drove to the Silver Vault, an upscale pawn and antique shop in the city known for handling high-end estates. The owner, a man named Elias, with skin like parchment, looked up as the bell chimed. I have an heirloom, I said, my voice cracking. I hoisted the box onto his velvet-to-pepped counter. Elias smiled professionally, reaching for his jeweler's loupe. 19th century silver is always in demand. Let's see what. The moment his fingers touched the mahogany wood, his smile vanished. He didn't just pull his hand away, he recoiled, his chair screeching against the floor. He looked at his hand, then at me. His fingertips were white, as if the heat had been sucked out of them. As if the heat had been sucked out of them. Get that out of here, he whispered. Please, I begged. It's sterling. It's a complete set. Look at the hallmarks. I don't care if it's made of solid gold, Elias hissed, his eyes wide with a look I recognized. Pure, instinctual flight or fight. That metal is sick. I can hear it, girl. Can't you? It's screaming. I didn't hear anything but the hum of the air conditioner. Take it, he said, reaching under the counter and pulling out a heavy iron poker to shove the box away from him. Go. Now. before the air in here turns. I hauled the box back to the car. My arms were starting to ache with a strange, deep cold. I drove to a construction site 5 miles out, near the industrial docks. I saw a massive, overflowing dumpster filled with drywall and rusted rebar. I didn't think, I just acted. I heaved the mahogany chest over the side. I watched it disappear into the filth, buried under a sheet of moldy plywood. I drove away, sobbing with relief. I called Mark. It's gone. I dumped it. It's over. But as I drove, I noticed something in the cup holder. A small, silver salt spoon. It hadn't been there when I started the car. I grabbed it and threw it out the window, watching it bounce off the pavement. I kept driving, but the taste in my mouth, that rot, that copper, suddenly got stronger. It felt thick, like I was choking on a mouthful of coins. I reached the motel room at 4:15 p.m. My jaw ached from clenching it, and my tongue felt like a piece of dead leather in my mouth. I swiped the key card. The green light flickered, and I pushed the door open. "Mark?" I called out. The room was freezing. The wall unit was blowing air, but it wasn't the smell of a stale motel room anymore. It was that smell. Sulfur. Copper. Old, wet velvet. Mark was standing in the center of the room, facing away from me. He was stripped to the waist, his back a map of goosebumps. He didn't turn around when I entered. He was staring at the bed. My heart stopped. There, sitting on the cheap polyester floral bedspread, was the mahogany chest. It was freshly polished. The grime I had seen on the brass latches for days was gone. They gleamed like new gold. The wood glowed with a deep, dark luster, as if it had been oiled with something rich and heavy. "I tried to throw it out the window," Mark whispered. His voice was a dry rattle. I picked it up to throw it out, Sarah, but it was too heavy. And then I realized it wasn't the box. He turned around slowly. His hands were covered in fine silver dust. But that wasn't the worst part. The 3 puncture wounds on his chest had changed. They weren't scabbing. Instead, something metallic was peeping out from beneath the skin. A dull silver shimmer, like the tip of a needle-sharp tine pushing its way out from his ribs. I looked back at the bed. The lid of the box was open. The midnight blue velvet was no longer dry. It was saturated, dripping a dark, viscous liquid onto the bedspread. It wasn't water. It was thick and smelled of iron. All 144 pieces were gone from their slots. They were laid out on the duvet, but they weren't in a grid anymore. They were arranged in the shape of a person. The dinner knives formed the long bones of the legs. The forks were interlaced to create a rib cage. The spoons were layered like scales to form a head, and the tiny, sharp seafood forks were positioned like teeth inside a silver mouth. It was a silhouette of a woman, a silver bride laid out on our bed. It followed me, I sobbed, backing toward the door. "Mark, we have to run. We have to leave everything." "I can't," Mark said. He looked down at his own hands. His fingernails were turning a polished, reflective gray. "I can't leave them, Sarah. They're so cold. They just want to be warm." He reached out toward the silver silhouette. As his fingers brushed the ribcage made of forks, the metal didn't clatter. It chimed. A high, sweet, singing note that vibrated in my teeth. The silver figure on the bed shifted, only slightly. The head made of those layered spoons turned toward me. I ran. I didn't grab Mark. I didn't grab my purse. I heard the high melodic chiming of 144 pieces of silver sliding across polyester, and I bolted. I drove until the gas light came on. Then I ditched the car in a suburban mall parking lot in another state. I'm writing this from a public library in a town I won't name. It's been 6 days since I saw Mark standing in that motel room. I've tried calling his phone 100 times. It goes straight to voicemail. On the 4th day, I received a text from his number. It was just a photo. It showed the interior of the mahogany box. The velvet was no longer blue. It was a deep, pulpy crimson. And there was a new slot in the tray, a long, narrow groove that hadn't been there before. I think I'm safe for now, but my body is changing. The gray burn on my tongue never healed. It's hardened. Yesterday, I tried to bite into an apple, and I heard a sickening crack. My front tooth didn't break. It chipped the apple. When I looked in the mirror, the enamel was gone. In its place was a jagged, reflective surface. Every morning, I wake up and my joints feel stiff, frozen. until I move them enough to hear the clink, clink, clink of my bones grinding together. I've stopped eating. I can't stand the taste of food. Everything tastes like copper. Everything tastes like it's screaming for a polish. I've noticed that if I stay in the dark too long, my reflection in the window starts to move independently. It looks at me with silver eyes and beckons. It wants me to come home. It wants me to finish the set. Do not open it. Do not sign for it. Do not even touch the wood. If you find a single piece of silver in your house that you don't recognize, leave. Burn the house down. Don't look back. The silver is beautiful. It's timeless. It's elegant. But it's hungry. And once it has a taste of you, it never stops wanting more. I have to go now. The librarian is looking at me strangely. She's holding a letter opener, and the way the light is hitting the blade, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I think I'm going to go ask her if I can help her polish it.